In 1854, two brothers built a mill to feed their town, but they had no idea that behind those grinding stones, they were also crushing trust, hiding secrets, and setting the stage for a betrayal that would echo through generations. In the rolling hills of 1854 Connecticut, tucked between dense woods and winding rivers, lay the quiet farming town of Westbury. Life there moved at a slow, honest pace. Families worked the land, children walked to school along dirt paths, and the town depended heavily on the strength of its people. Among them were two brothers, Samuel and Elias Hartwell, known not for their wealth, but for their work ethic, their bond, and their vision. The Hartwell family had lived in Westbury for generations, surviving harsh winters and poor harvests. Their father had been a blacksmith, their mother a seamstress, and both had instilled in the boys a sense of duty and grit. When their parents passed, Samuel and Elias inherited nothing more than a patch of land, a shared cabin, and each other. But they had one idea that kept them going, building a mill of their own. It began not as a business plan, but a shared childhood dream. As boys, they had often followed the river that ran behind their home, throwing stones into the water and talking about what they would build one day. As they grew older, they saw how the town struggled without a local gristmill. Farmers had to cart their wheat and corn miles away to be processed, losing time, money, and sometimes the grain itself along the way. Samuel, always the thinker, believed they could change that. Elias, with his strong hands and tireless energy, believed they should. By early spring of 1854, the dream became real. The brothers cleared a patch of land near the bend of the river, where the water flowed fastest. There were no contractors or machines, just men, some tools, and the help of a few neighbors who believed in what they were doing. Samuel designed the mill himself, sketching plans by candlelight after long days of cutting timber. Elias worked from sunrise to sunset, hauling stone, hammering beams, and shaping the great wooden water wheel that would power it all. It was back-breaking labor, but neither brother complained. With every beam they raised, and every nail they drove, they were building more than a mill. They were building a future. By midsummer, the structure stood tall, sturdy, and proud beside the rushing river. The water wheel turned slowly, then smoothly, humming with purpose. The grinding stones, carved from nearby rock, were lowered into place with great care. Inside, the mill smelled of fresh wood, sawdust, and effort. The first sack of grain was ground under Elias's watchful eye, while Samuel recorded the numbers in a neat, leather-bound ledger. When they opened the doors to the townspeople in late August, the entire valley seemed to gather. Farmers brought their harvests, families came to look, and children marveled at the great spinning wheel. There was music, food, and the rare sound of pride ringing through the air. For a while, everything was good. Business came in steady. People were grateful. The Hartwell mill became the center of Westbury's small economy, turning grain into bread, dreams into something real. Samuel handled the accounts with care, keeping detailed records of every bushel, every cent. Elias took charge of the operations running the mill, organizing pickups, and meeting with the farmers who came in daily. Together, they moved like parts of the same machine, each brother completing the other. But even in success, cracks began to form. They weren't obvious at first, just small changes. Samuel, once open with everything, started keeping the ledger locked in a drawer. He said it was for safekeeping, but Elias didn't remember needing a key before. Then there was Clara, the schoolteacher, from the edge of town. She had a gentle voice and curious eyes, and Elias had fallen for her faster than he expected. He spent more time away from the mill, walking her home, sitting under the trees with her, dreaming different dreams. Samuel noticed, but said nothing. The silence between them slowly grew. They still worked together, still spoke, but something was missing. The laughter, the shared meals, the late-night talks, they faded. Samuel grew tense, distracted. He began making decisions without asking Elias. Orders were placed for new equipment without discussion. Elias felt like a partner in name only. And when he asked questions, Samuel always replied with the same tired line, "Trust me, I've got it handled." One evening, after a long day, Elias arrived early to the mill and noticed the ledger left open on the desk. He hadn't seen it in weeks. Curiosity got the better of him. As he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. Some numbers didn't match. A few names were crossed out. One page had been carefully torn from the middle, as if to erase something entirely. When Samuel arrived moments later, Elias confronted him quietly. Samuel didn't deny it. He simply closed the book, locked it again, and left the room. Neither of them spoke of it after that. From that point on, The distance became real. Elias focused on Clara. Samuel buried himself in the mill's finances. They worked in silence, side by side, yet miles apart. The townspeople noticed. Some said the brothers were just tired. Others whispered of disagreements, of money gone missing, of pride turning to bitterness. But the truth was simpler and sadder. They had built something beautiful together, but they had forgotten to protect the one thing that mattered most, their bond. And while the wheel outside continued to spin, something inside had started to break. By the time the leaves turned gold in the fall of 1856, the Hartwell mill stood as a symbol of success in Westbury. Farmers came from towns over. Children grew up hearing the low rumble of grinding stones as background music to their days. The Hartwell name had become more than familiar, it had become trusted. And yet, inside the tall wooden frame of that mill, something vital had been lost. Samuel and Elias still worked side by side, but they no longer shared meals, no longer made plans under the same roof. Clara had become a steady presence in Elias's life, and although he never said it out loud, he had imagined her becoming part of the Hartwell family. Samuel, however, had grown colder, focused, yes, but also distant in a way that even strangers could sense. The storm the night before had been rough. Rain had pounded the valley for hours, and the river had swollen with rage. But as Elias stepped inside the mill, what he saw didn't look like storm damage. The main gear, the one that drove the grinding stones, had been split nearly in half, not from rot, not from age, but from force. The bolts securing it had been removed. Tools were scattered across the floor. The damage looked deliberate. Elias stood still for several seconds, stunned not just by the destruction, but by the realization of what it meant. Someone had done this, and there were few people who even knew how the gear worked well enough to dismantle it. He waited until Samuel arrived. When he did, Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked, "What happened here?" Samuel didn't answer. He walked past him, sat at the desk, and opened the locked drawer. The ledger appeared, placed calmly on the table. "You want to see?" he said flatly, pushing the book forward. Elias opened it and started to flip through. Pages were missing, not torn wildly, but carefully removed. Transactions were erased or rewritten. Some numbers didn't add up. There were names listed that Elias didn't recognize. The book that once held the truth of their shared work now held something else, secrets and betrayal. Samuel offered no explanation. "It's better if you don't ask," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the wall. That was the last time the two brothers spoke. The next morning, Samuel was gone. His bed was empty, his horse missing from the barn. Clara was gone too. Her schoolhouse shuttered. Her belongings vanished, as if she had never been there at all. Elias searched the riverbank, thinking maybe Samuel had fallen, or worse, ended his life. But there were no signs of struggle, no tracks, no witnesses, just silence, as deep and final as the one that had grown between them. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Samuel had run off with the money and the woman. Others believed he had drowned himself, unable to face what he had done. A few believed Clara had convinced him to start over somewhere far from Westbury. Elias never spoke of it. He rebuilt the gear himself, repaired the damage, and reopened the mill within weeks. But something was missing, not just Samuel's hands, but his mind, his vision. The mill ran, but the soul was gone. Without Samuel, business slowed. Some farmers took their grain elsewhere, uncomfortable with the tension surrounding the Hartwell name. Others felt the magic was gone, the pride lost. Elias worked alone, day after day, but he no longer cared about profit. He cared only about the rhythm, the motion of the stones, the sound of the wheel, the pulse of something still turning, even as everything else had stopped. The winter that followed was brutal. Snow fell early and heavy. Elias kept the mill open as long as he could, but the costs mounted. Repairs were needed. Orders were late. One morning, he arrived to find frost inside the mill, covering the floor like a warning. The firewood pile was nearly gone. His hands cracked from the cold. He sat at the desk, opened the ledger, and stared at the empty space where Samuel's pages once were. In the spring of 1857, Elias closed the mill for the last time. No ceremony, no farewell, just a locked door and a walk home under gray skies. He moved out of the cabin a few months later. No one knows where he went. Some say he stayed in the hills, living quietly until he died. Others believe he left the town altogether, unable to bear the weight of what had been lost. Years passed. The mill stood abandoned, swallowed slowly by vines and time. The river still flowed, indifferent. Children who wandered too close would dare each other to look inside. Some swore they heard footsteps. Others claimed they saw a man standing in the shadows, holding a book. The townspeople spoke of the Hartwell brothers as a story now, a lesson, a warning, or a ghost tale, depending on who was telling it. But the truth was simpler. Two brothers had built something great with their hands, and they had lost it, piece by piece, not because of a storm or a stranger, but because they forgot to protect what truly mattered, trust. What they ground in that mill was never just grain, it was hopes, loyalty, pride, and love. And when those things broke, they left behind more than ruins. They left behind a silence that could still be heard, if you listened close enough. 30 years passed. Seasons changed. The town of Westbury grew in quiet ways, and the mill remained, but as a ruin, not a landmark. Covered in vines, half sunken into the riverbank, the once proud Hartwell mill had become a forgotten monument. Most people walked past without looking. A few, mostly older folks, still remembered the brothers and whispered stories about them. Some said Elias had returned late at night to visit. Others claimed the ghost of Samuel was still inside, flipping through a phantom ledger by candlelight. But the truth was that no one really knew what had happened. The story had faded into myth until the spring of 1887, when a young schoolteacher named Mary Caldwell arrived in Westbury to take over the now rebuilt schoolhouse. She had no idea about the Hartwell brothers or the haunted mill. She came with her books, her soft voice, and a hunger for history. It wasn't long before one of her students, a boy named Henry, brought her a strange item wrapped in burlap, a small water-damaged journal he had found while exploring the old mill. "My grandpa says this place used to be important," the boy said, "but nobody talks about it anymore." Mary took the journal home. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages fragile. Most of the ink was faded, but here and there, words still whispered from the paper. Samuel's handwriting, dates, numbers, names of farmers long buried. It was the missing ledger. But deeper inside, toward the back, the numbers stopped. What came next wasn't bookkeeping, it was confession. Samuel had written about guilt, about fear, about how he had borrowed money from the wrong people in Hartford to cover repairs during the early days of the mill. He hadn't told Elias. He thought he could fix it himself. But the debts had grown. Clara, it seemed, had once worked for those creditors. She had come to Westbury not by accident, but by design. At first, Samuel had resisted her influence, but over time, desperation blurred his judgment. She convinced him to make quiet deals, to move money through fake transactions, to survive just a little longer. He had intended to fix everything once he was in the clear, but time ran out. And when Elias finally opened the ledger that day, Samuel knew the truth was heavier than the river. He had not just betrayed his brother, he had poisoned the very thing they'd built together. In the final pages, Samuel wrote of leaving not out of cowardice, but to protect Elias from further shame. "If I stay," he wrote, "they'll destroy us both. If I go, maybe one of us can still live." He hadn't run off with Clara in love. He had been forced to flee, and Clara had gone with him, not willingly, but as part of the scheme. In his final entry, he wrote, "The river carried away my sin, but it never took my regret." Mary sat with the journal, for hours, shaken. She wasn't sure what to do with it. The story it told wasn't just personal, it was a piece of the town's history, one buried under silence and shame. She brought the journal to the town historian, Mr. Aldridge, who confirmed its authenticity. It caused a quiet stir among the elders of Westbury. Some refused to believe it, others wept, and a few simply nodded, as if the truth had finally caught up with the legend. The town council voted to preserve what remained of the Hartwell mill, not as a ghost story, but as a memorial. They placed a plaque at the site. Here stood the mill that ground more than grain. It held dreams, it held sorrow, and it held the story of two brothers. Years later, tourists would stop to read the plaque, and Mary would guide students through the woods to teach them about not just industry, but integrity. But one more thing happened before the story truly ended. In the summer of 1890, a man arrived in Westbury. He was old, thin, dressed in black, and walked with a heavy cane. He said nothing as he passed through the streets. Some thought he was a drifter, others thought he looked familiar, but it wasn't until he reached the mill ruins that someone recognized his eyes, eyes that once watched water turn a wheel. It was Elias. He had returned, nearly 4 decades after disappearing. Mary, then older and still teaching, met him there. They didn't speak much. He didn't ask about the ledger, only if the stone wheel was still buried beneath the river mud. She told him yes, and he smiled. For the next 2 weeks, Elias visited the mill every morning, sitting in the same spot until dusk. Then, one morning, he didn't come. They found him beneath a willow tree near the water, his hat resting beside him, eyes closed as if asleep. In his coat pocket was a folded paper, a final note, written in a shaking hand. He was my brother. I forgave him long ago. And so the story ended where it began, beside the river, at a mill that had once pulsed with ambition and had fallen silent with sorrow. But silence is never empty. Sometimes it holds memory, sometimes forgiveness, and sometimes, if you listen closely, it carries the final words of a man who lost everything, and yet came home to find peace not in the wheel, but in the quiet that followed. If this story moved you, like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to The Silent Ledger for more dark and untold histories.